Hi everyone. Here's an explanation of how I set up my chest and waist proportions in order to focus on hip isolations when dancing. In case you don't know, a hip isolation is basically when you roll your hips, you want really the hips to move independently of the upper torso and ideally the lower part of the body. But the idea here is basically there's not very much translation that happens in the hip area. It's all just rotation. Now, because SlimeVR is based on forward kinematics, basically what happens is that there's a rotation sensor here, which gets rotated as you rotate your hips. And so you can imagine that if there was a very long, let's say rope tied between your chest and your hips, in order for me to rotate 30 degrees this way, I'd have to swing along that rope. And so what that would mean is if I did my hip roll, instead of it being all in one spot, it would be like this, where it's all really far out there. In order to dial that in, what we need to do is we need to make the connection point between the chest and the hip much, much shorter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically have my chest tracker all the way down here. And that's how it is currently configured. And I'll show you that when I calibrate. You can see that the chest tracker that appears, this is the bottom part of it, the end of this green arrow. The green arrows represent essentially where the chest tracker is with respect to the actual bones and the avatar. And so in this case, the chest tracker is at the bottom of this green arrow, and the hip tracker is at the top of this green arrow. So there's really not a lot of space between the two. You might have expected that the chest tracker would be up here, but no, it's all the way down here instead. Let me show you one more time what it looks like doing a hip roll like this. Notice not too much translation. There's still some in the lower body because I'm, bending my spine and the proportions aren't 100% correct, but mostly the translation is in one spot. Now let me show you what happens. Pay attention to the top left of the screen here. Let me show you what happens when I change my chest length to be a lot shorter. So I'm going to enter calibration mode so you can see how it's moving as I do this. And I'm shortening it now. And now it's like kind of at the same part of my body that my chest tracker is actually strapped. It's basically on the rib cage, but at the very bottom of it. So now I'm going to lock in that calibration again. And you can see that when I do a hip roll, it's all over the place. Now I'm hula hooping instead of doing a hip isolation. Remember, for good dancing, we usually want that hip isolation to be very little translation and mostly rotation. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to set the chest back how it used to be. And notice how close it gets to the actual waist. I mean, I'm only like 3 centimeters from it right now. If I actually reset the virtual waist, you'll see how close the spots actually are. I've just lowered the virtual waist to be a bit close to the actual hips. And now I'm going to lock that in. And you can see that the hip is isolated. Thanks everyone. Hope that was helpful. Talk to you later.